So today I am going to be doing a wrap up of my first 4 awkward. Today I'm going to be doing so I'm a few days late to the game, but basically we're in the first week of May, so I'm going to be wrapping up the books I read in 2020 from January, February, March, and April. So the first third of the year. Let's get started. I read 61 books so far this year. Not all of them were like full-length novels. I also read comics and graphic novels this year, like I always do, and some shorter novels for my Short Lives book club that I mentioned in my BookTube newbie tag. So let's dive in, shall we? This is going to be like a super casual video since I'm just going to be looking on my phone and stuff. I filmed my BookTube newbie video yesterday and I wanted to sort of dive in so I can introduce myself better to BookTube and get in on some conversations. So I'm not sure yet if I'm going to talk about all 61 books that I read, but I'm definitely going to be touching on my favorite and least favorite books that I read, the ones that really made an impression. The first book that I finished in 2021 was The Prisoner of Azkaban by J.K. Rowling. I also finished reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire this year. So I've read both of those many times before. I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, but I don't think I actually mentioned this in my BookTube newbie tag video. I meant to, but my boyfriend and I, we've been together about 2 years, and when I first met him, he had not read them. He had watched all of the Harry Potter movies, but only like once. I got a head nod. He's watched all the movies only about once before, but he's never read any of the books. So maybe since about like 6 months into dating each other, we have been reading all of the books together out loud and going slowly through all of them. So I'm really proud that we finished 4 whole books together so far, because when you're reading aloud, it's pretty slow going. But it's been really fun because he sort of knows the general sort of some of the plot points, but forgets a lot of things. Yeah, it's been really fun to read them together, and then we watch the movie each time afterwards so he can be rightfully infuriated. And I've got to say, I mean, that's one of my main comments. I always like The Prisoner of Azkaban. Everyone likes that one. It's not one of my top ones, but I still love it. Big note on that one. They make Snape so much nicer in the movies. I mean, in the book, Snape is such a douchebag. A little spoiler here if you haven't somehow read Harry Potter yet, but when they're under the Whomping Willow, when Snape comes in upon them and he's basically just like, I'm gonna make sure you die from Dementors, serious? And tries to get Harry expelled and whatnot, like, that's not in the movies. And then, if we're talking about the movies, Goblet of Fire, I mean, like I said, I've read these many times before, but I always forget each time I reread just how angry I am that there's no Winky in the movie. Justice for Winky. Justice for Spew and the House Elves. I mean, Hermione, I still think she's nice in the movies, very well played by Emma Watson, but we miss so much of her character in the movies. I mean, she's just so cool. She's the real hero of the books, and I just love the whole Spew side plot. I mean, to eliminate Winky, because if you've read The Goblet of Fire, you remember Winky is a key factor in the plot of the book. But she's obviously not a key factor in the plot of the movie because they completely erase her. So that's a big change. Big change. I'm mad about it. Like I said, I've read a couple of graphic novels and comics over the time, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, I think I decided, but I want to highlight my favorite series that I've read in this time, and that is by far the Ascender and Descender series. Let me double check. I think, was Descender the original one? Okay, yeah, so the first series is Descender, and then sort of the sequel series is Ascender, and I will say I like both of them, but I like Descender a lot more. I was sort of obsessed with it when I read it. So it's a graphic novel, and all of the art is done in this really beautiful watercolor style. So that had me like right off the hook. When I first saw it, I was like, watercolor for graphic novels? I mean, I really like Ben Templesmith's illustrations for books like, the Wormwood series, and he's done some for like Batman. Maybe I can put some here. but I was like, oh, a sci-fi series with watercolor art? But let me tell you, it is like nothing you've seen. It's gorgeous. So this is full of watercolor robots. If you're anything like me, that has already sold you. And these robots have the best personalities too. It's great. So let me read you the blurb for Descender on Goodreads. Let's see. So it says, young robot boy Tim 21 and his companions struggle to stay alive in a universe where all androids have been outlawed and bounty hunters lurk on every planet. That wasn't a very exciting blurb. Basically, it's gotten to the point where there was this huge cataclysmic event with what we call the Descenders, basically these giant robots that destroy whole worlds. And after this big event, robots are outlawed. However, one of our main characters is Tim 21, who is an android companion robot from a boy in a mining colony. So we're learning all about his story, the story of the boy he left behind, the story of some adorable mining robots, which I've got to say, worth watching alone. Driller, a real killer. There's a whole backstory for the robot that shouts Driller, a real killer. And he is the best character, actually. And yeah, and then you have like the nerdy scientist, the determined alien military captain woman. It's great. I mean, I'm not giving it a very good blurb. Maybe I'll do a full review at some point. I might have to refresh, but I just loved it. The characters were amazing. You really felt connected to them. The art, like I said, it was gorgeous. And I thought it was a really interesting and captivating story. Now, when you go to Ascender, we move away from robots and move more towards magic. And I still like that, but like, it wasn't quite as captivating having the watercolor with magic versus watercolor with robots, because I've seen plenty of watercolor magic. I just thought the plot was a little less original so far, but still very worth watching. You have some crossover with some of the characters, but yeah, highly recommend Ascender and Descender series. Okay, another graphic novel. I think this is what you'd call it. It's like a graphic novel memoir. But anyway, another graphic novel I really loved in 2021. I read it in, I think, January. Was Solutions and Other Problems by Allie Brosh. Now, if you read her blog, and I think it's the same name as the other book of hers that she's published and I've read called Hyperbole and a Half, you know she's hysterical. So all of her drawings are sort of just like stick figures, but the stories she tells are so funny. I mean, I read some of them at work and I felt really weird because I was like dying of laughter in the back of my desk. The patrons could probably hear it in the front of the library. But she just tells these really funny stories. Like, I think my funniest one, she talks about just like a bucket that was in her driveway when she was little that she just became determined to fit into. Or a neighbor's house that she decides to start investigating through the dog door. Like, the stories, they're ridiculous, but somehow, because they're about this weird sort of little people we are as children, I think they're extremely like sort of over the top, but still so relatable. And I think that's what makes her stories really funny. Plus, even though her art is stick figures, the emotions, spot on. She really draws them just right there. One of the first fiction books I read this year that I highly recommend was Ring Shout by P. Djèlí Clark. And that book, I'm trying to remember how I described it to my friends when I was telling them to read it. If you like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, supernatural, like monster hunting sort of stories, it's that, but the monsters are Ku Klux Klan members. So they're like monster hunting racists. And not only are they like monsters as in like, oh, you gotta be a monster to be that hateful, but they're like literal monsters from another like dimension, I think. So they're fighting these monsters called Ku Kluxes. Oh my god, my dog. But in the story, there are these, oh my god, I'm just gonna talk over my dog. So basically in the book, there are these monsters called Ku Kluxes. So they're like these giant white cone-headed monsters. And so the idea is they start out as regular old people with some biases and then become more hateful racists, and then they like I forget if they turn into the monsters or if the monsters are like parasites that latch and form onto them. But basically they go from little old small town racist to like full on full-fledged Ku Klux Klan monster. And I just loved that. I mean, I think it was a great sort of dark satirical commentary on basically how insidious racism is. You know, it latches on small, it can latch on to anyone. If those biases are there in our society, then anyone can be vulnerable to these racist ideas. And once that monster latches on, baby can just slide down that road to being a monster. And in the book, basically a screening of a very racist film from real life is being screened, and so they're basically expecting that there's going to be an explosion of Ku Kluxes out there. So again, commentary on incendiary media, how harmful it can be in forming racist and racist opinions. And so yeah, basically they're expecting that there's just going to be an explosion of these Ku Kluxes after the screening of this hateful racist film, and they're getting ready to do some battle. And I just thought it was badass. It was very clever, and I really enjoyed reading it. It was, yeah, just a good quick read. It's a pretty short book, and I highly recommend. Another book that's not very new, but I read early on this year that I highly recommend is Before the Coffee Gets Cold, and that is by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. So in this story, basically there is a small cafe in Japan, and I was proud because I got my mom to read this too. I love a lot of Japanese literature. She doesn't really read so much, but she loved this book too. But anyway, there is a small cafe in Japan. It is not super popular, but at one point it was very famous in the media because they said that if you go to this cafe, you can travel back in time. So basically it's separated into chapters where each chapter is it centers around a different character who goes back in time. But the thing is, you'd think, oh, it's a time machine cafe, everybody's gonna go back in time. But the characters soon find out, like the first character who's not familiar, that not that many people go here and use it because the rules to go back in time are very specific. Basically, you can only sit in one chair in the restaurant. It's occupied by a ghost. The ghost only gets up once a day to go to the bathroom, and you have to go and sit there when they leave. You're poured a cup of coffee by someone from the cafe. You travel back in time, and you have to finish the cup of coffee before it gets cold. When you finish the cup of coffee, you'll be transported back to the present. But if you do not finish your coffee in the time before it gets cold, you will become the ghost. Another rule is that you can only visit people who have been to the cafe before, and you have to stay in the chair while you're there. So basically it's very specific rules. There are limited things you can do going back in the cafe. But yeah, I thought the premise was really cool, but what I really loved about the book were just the stories. I mean, it just talks so much about the fact that it's not so much changing the things in our past that's important, but reframing the ways that we feel about it. Because they found out another rule was that you can't change the future at all. So people thought, okay, why am I gonna bother going back to the past if I can't change anything? You know, why would I visit my former love if I can't do anything to keep them and change what happened? But the idea is that, you know, relationships in our life are precious, our memories are precious, and that, you know, the past is in the past, but we can reframe the way we think about things and change our realities that way, I guess. But I mean, I really liked that. It made me laugh, it made me cry, all the good markers of a nice, comforting read. I will say, yeah, I think the last two stories I sobbed a lot, so bring some tissues and definitely read it. One book I read that was pandemic themed that one of my co-workers recommended to me, and I highly recommend. Maybe I'll do a COVID read video sometime. Anyway, a very timely book that was actually written a couple years ago is Severance by Ling Ma, and I really recommend that. So basically in this book, we follow a young woman who has an internship or job. Let me check. It's been a little while since I read this. I forget exactly what her official job is, but basically she's a millennial living in New York City, working an office job, sort of, they call her in the blurb like a millennial office drone, but just, you know, goes to work and back every single day. But sort of at the start of the book, we've gotten the impression that there's been like a societal collapse due to a pandemic. It basically follows this girl, and as the pandemic unfolds, their pandemic, not ours, she creates a blog called New York Ghost, where she just goes around the city and films in between the time that she's actually still going to her work building every day, because she signed like some sort of in-person worker form. And I'm not kidding. Ling Ma, she's a prophet, it seems. She kept working as sort of like an essential worker, and signed this form saying, you know, if you go to work and keep coming, like, you'll get paid a bunch of money at the end. And so even as like all of her executives have died or, you know, gone zombie-like and all this stuff, she keeps just going to work this whole time. And I just felt like the whole story really, it feels like the, you can tell this is my DSA sort of like socialist heart here, but it feels like the pandemic is capitalism. It's really, you have to read it to understand. But I mean, I loved, there was just so much like millennial sarcasm and irony, and I think anyone of my generation would probably really appreciate it. Yeah, her whole idea, I think that I really felt was capitalism doesn't have a whole lot to offer to the young generations anymore, and you see it sort of crumbling apart, and the irony of like a dead world where the people who still survive are like driving taxis around with no passengers and going to their office buildings, and you're like, what up next couple years? 2 books that came out this year that were highly anticipated for me and I really enjoyed were Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas, who wrote The Hate You Give and On the Come Up, if you've read and enjoyed those as well. So that's a young adult book. And Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, who is one of my favorite writers, winner of the Nobel Prize for Fiction, so my boy. But I was so excited for both of these books, and they did not disappoint. Read them. So basically, Concrete Rose is about, so basically if you've read The Hate You Give and you remember the main character's parents, especially her dad Maverick, they are the main characters of Concrete Rose. So it basically goes back into, I forget if it's the 80s or 90s, but back in Garden Heights where The Hate You Give is set, and it centers around the character of Maverick, the dad from Hate You Give, and he has just found out that he got a woman he had a one-night stand with pregnant. Unfortunately, that means he has to tell his girlfriend, who he was on a break with for a couple days, when he slept with this other woman. So just right from the first chapter, I was hooked. Yeah, it was a really good plot, and then she does such a good job. I mean, Angie Thomas, I love all of her books. She's just so good at capturing these characters' hearts and feelings and just making you really empathize with all the characters, really getting you hooked on the drama right away. And yeah, she had me hook, line, and sinker right from the beginning, because basically the way this starts, he goes to the clinic with this woman in, I think, the beginning of the second chapter, to see whether he or his best friend are the father of her child. It turns out he's the father. He goes back to the waiting room. The baby's there, and there is no mother in sight. So all of a sudden, he is a single father. So I thought, yeah, she had me hooked right away. It was a great book. She has you really connect to the characters, and you really feel for Maverick as he has to try to make this choice that, again, I think millennials will relate to, where he can work a respectable job for almost no money an hour after taxes, and much harder work for much less pay, or he can continue selling drugs with his gang as he's been doing. But then, what life is he going to give his child? Will people who see him as a parent see him as a respectable parent? And these struggles she really lays out in this book, and I think she does a great job. Klara and the Sun is Kazuo Ishiguro's newest book. I love his books. His book Never Let Me Go is one of my favorite books of all time. So I've just been so excited for this one. Especially as all the reviews ahead of time were telling me after Never Let Me Go, which was, I think people call it sci-fi, I don't know. It has sci-fi elements in it at least. But this book is also sort of literary fiction with sci-fi elements, sci-fi with literary fiction elements. I don't know what you want to call it. I feel like, I guess let's just call it sci-fi, because I hate sort of these highbrow, lowbrow sort of judgments that go into sci-fi, where sci-fi is dope, y'all, and I feel like by distinguishing it as not literary fiction is sort of saying that, okay, sci-fi is not as good somehow. Sci-fi is great. Anyway, let's get into this. Klara and the Sun is basically about I forget what they called her, basically a companion robot named Klara, who is waiting at a store to become the companion to a young girl. And she is obsessed with the sun because she's solar powered. But yeah, she basically talks with other droids, robots, companion bots in the store about the sun, how it basically like a god. And eventually she is adopted by a girl, and she seems very sick. And basically this plot unfolds where you find out that there's some sort of really risky procedure that uplifts kids. And I think it's basically like they're boosting their IQ. I don't know. But it's risky because a lot of people die in the process. And so Klara is trying to support her while she's sick and trying to work on being successful, while in the meantime sort of witnessing this turbulent relationship between her companion and her companion's like sort of next door neighbor, who is not an uplifted. He's just like a regular guy like us. And they have sort of a romance maybe going, except at the same time you get this weird power dynamic where it's like he's so smart, but she's had this advantage. So who's really going to be the successful one, and how are they going to feel about each other? So I thought that was compelling, and Klara is a charming character, and I highly recommend you check it out. Okay, so this is taking a long time, so I'm actually going to wrap it up soon. I'm definitely not going to review all of the books. I'm going to mention here, I'll mention it in another video, but I've been rereading the Chronicles of Narnia series, and I'm planning on doing a video of that, wrapping it up once I've reread all of them. I guess one final book that I want to mention that I've read in the past couple months is Terminal Boredom by... I thought I had it right near here. I'll look it up on the phone. I think it's on my piano downstairs. So yeah, another book, actually the most recent book I finished, and it came out I think last month. I got it as part of my Verso book club subscription. Now Verso is like a political left book publisher, and they do a lot of nonfiction books, but occasionally some fiction books as well. But yeah, so the collection, it was a collection of short stories I read. It was called Terminal Boredom by Izumi Suzuki. And if you are a fan of Octavia Butler and like Ursula K. Le Guin, who else? Even like N.K. Jemisin, I think you would like these. Basically, it's a collection of short stories that are all sort of, yeah, I think they could all broadly be classified as sci-fi. But she explores different social and political topics through her different sci-fi short stories. I especially like the first one, where she examines sort of a world where declining birth rates for men have made it so that women have taken hold of society and men are kept in a different like area, and basically women go there when they're about to graduate high school to meet the guys. And I don't want to give too much of the stories away, because I feel like if short stories, they have like a climax, you give it away, you should read them. But basically I thought that the story was really interesting because you sort of get the idea of she's curious about men growing up, and when she meets them, the way she talks about them was so disturbing. It was like livestock, and it really goes to show how you can frame anything to make people feel any way you want. And it's scary. It's something I think people need to be aware of. All throughout history you see that happening, and you see it happening now in our modern age. That'll then be set down in history, and our future generations will judge us for our racist society. But I don't want to give too much away. But yeah, if you like Octavia Butler, if you like N.K. Jemisin, if you like Ursula K. Le Guin, you'll probably like these short stories. I feel like I've just talked about how much I love things. I do think I tend to read stuff that I've already figured out I'm going to like. But I did read one book I did not like, and it was The Archer by Paulo Coelho. I was just so disappointed. I mean, I read, which book of his did I read last year? I read The Alchemist last year. It wasn't my favorite book, but I thought it was cool. I listened to it as an audiobook actually. But I saw the cover art for this in one of the book magazines before it came out, and I thought the art looked really cool. There's like a picture of an archer on the front. It's done in sort of like Japanese ink painting style. And I will say I loved the illustrations throughout the book. The illustrations were really cool. That's what grabbed me into reading it. But I mean, maybe you can like it for what it is, but if you're expecting a story, you ain't gonna find it in this book. It really read like a coffee table or top of the toilet book of inspirational phrases that really just seems sort of like forcibly put onto this metaphor of archery. It didn't even work a lot of the time. And I was so disappointed. I mean, the first the first couple pages seem to be about like a guy visiting this archer, and they have an archery contest, and it seems like a setup for a sort of interesting story. And then you just get little inspirational quotes for the rest of the book. There's some cool pictures, but there's like nothing. It's like they published the first few paragraphs of an interesting short story and then a bunch of nothing. I was so disappointed. This might seem a little savage, but I got 1 star from me on Goodreads. Is what it is. So those are my most notable reads from 2021 so far. If you want to see a full list of all of the things I've read, you can check out my Goodreads. I'll put the link below, but if you look at my 2021 reading challenge, you can see all 61 titles I've read this year. I'll check in again at the halfway mark for the year of which additional books I've read. That Moomin post I mentioned in my last video will be coming soon. I think next week I'll upload a video all about the wonderful world of Moomin and why you should dive in, whether you're a kid or an adult. So I'll see y'all later. Thanks for checking it out.